Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you may happen to be and whether you're watching live or archived. And welcome to another in the Nautel Transmission Talk Tuesday webinar series. If you're keeping score at home, I think I'm over halfway mark for getting them right more than I've got it wrong. We'll call that a win. I'm your host, Jeff Welton, and today we're going to talk about STLs, radio STLs to be specific, the RF kind. And we'll talk about several things. I've got a couple of good friends because we're here to tell you that my knowledge of STLs usually stops at the transmitter's exciter, and we need people smarter than me to talk about this stuff. So I've got my good friend Josh Bone, President and CEO of Bone Broadcast Services down in Chelsea, Alabama. Chelsea Station, right, Josh?
No, we moved.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Chelsea Station was a hole. We moved out of there.
There you go. And Josh is one of my only friends who some of his cats like me better than him, but
yeah, keep telling yourself that. Yeah.
And we've also got another friend from the opposite end of the climate spectrum, from the scenic metropolis of St. Cloud, Minnesota, Alex Hartman. Alex, thanks and welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Howdy.
Hi.
Now, speaking of the opposite end of the climate spectrum, Dennis Switzer's thrown in a good morning from beautiful Wyoming. And anyway, thanks, Dennis. Last but not least, I want to thank Ed Sylvester, aka Disembodied Voice. He's the marketing and events specialist at Nautel, and Ed's the guy that makes everything happen. So, Ed, thanks to you for putting this all together. And I'd like to say making me look good, but there's a limit to even how much you can do. So we'll just roll with that. A couple of housekeeping. I knew he was going to unmute for that one. A couple of housekeeping comments before we get rolling. If you're new to our webinars, you'll see, number one, these Tuesday ones are pretty informal. We don't hold too much sacred, including yours truly, and that's as it should be. If you do have questions, comments, criticisms, or concerns, you've got two choices. You can enter it as a text box in the little question window, or you can hit the hand wavy icon and we'll unmute your mic and bring you on board. We're going to have a lot of back and forth today. We're going to cover a lot of things. First thing, let's double check everybody's reaction time on the little question window. Anybody who can tell me the character that was portrayed by Ed's profile picture on the title slide, we'll send a swag kit to them. Type it into the question box. None of the people that are participating in this webinar are allowed to contribute. So first person to type the character from the title page for Mr. Disembodied Voice will get a swag kit, and we'll carry on with the rest of this while we wait for that to come in. So just like being on the radio, so to speak. You didn't know there was going to be a quiz, did you? So usual, mandatory, we'll talk amongst ourselves. We'll open things up and talk to you guys. Bill says Yogi Bear, and Bill, I'm sorry, but that is wrong. I need this is where I need a mixer with one of those little FX boxes where I can just hit the wah, wah, wah. All right, Bob Trimble. Bob Trimble got the actor, but not the character, so we'll give it to him. I've got Jeff. I've got, what do I got? Disembodied voice person. SWAG stands for stuff we all get. Thank you, Mr. Gullickson, for that. That's an acronym I hadn't heard before. All right, moving on. So talking about radio STLs, we've killed 5 minutes and we haven't said a thing yet, and that's not a good start. It's like almost like a morning show here. So Ed, you're going to keep track of Bob's info and get, I think we've probably got his address, but double check and make sure, and we'll get Bob a little swag kit for guessing that Ed's profile picture was Matthew McConaughey. Bonus. And everybody knows, except me apparently, what movie that was from, because I'll dazed and confused. That's correct, Bob. Thank you. There you go. So he's definitely earned a swag kit. So we'll talk about licensed versus unlicensed STLs, the benefits and drawbacks of each, what's the frequency you should use. Apologies to REM for my song choice. I might not know movies, but I know a little bit about audio. Go figure, I work in radio, there's no pictures. All right, the coolest thing about this webinar was in doing the research for it, I learned that it's pronounced Fresnel zone, not Fresnel, not Fresnel, not anything else that I always thought it was over the years. So right off the bat, I learned something, came out better. We're going to talk about those a lot, and we're going to talk about them primarily using the station that I play with here locally as an example. I will warn you folks too, another little side note, we do have a tropical storm Teddy, or Hurricane Teddy, whatever he is when he crossed into our waters, is currently approaching from the south, and I see the rain and the wind outside the window there. So if I disconnect, Alex has got a copy of everything, and Alex will be taking control. You can blame it all on him after that.
You're gonna blame it on me anyway.
Oh,
That's true.
absolutely going to. So talking about Fresnel zones, and Alex, you've had a couple of situations where those came into play, and one of them you were talking about not too long ago.
Yeah, the one things that you don't really pay attention to is when the city decides to build a water tower in the middle of your STL path. It grazes the side of it pretty well. So yeah, you got to pay attention to your surroundings for sure, whether it's direct line of sight or just ever so slightly around it.
Put a passive
Right.
repeater on the top. That'll solve your problem.
Oh, the city wasn't having that because it was ugly.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And water towers, of course, are so scenic.
Right.
So
They have
the
fake tree
Fresnel,
branches sticking out of the top.
and that's why the Fresnel zones are so important, because although we tell you it's line of sight, it's not just the direct line between point A and point B, because the reflections do have a very significant impact on how receivable your signal is. Here's a question I throw at Josh. Digital versus analog, which would have more impact, or does it matter?
As far as on the Fresnel zone,
Yeah.
digital typically is what I've had more issues with as far as Fresnel clearance, because you tend to drop more packets. Analog, you can just power through. You might get a little bit of noise, but we had an instance in when I used to work in Dayton, Ohio. We had an STL, and I think it was a 22-mile path, and about a half a mile from the studio was a giant oak tree. And the oak tree continued to grow, and the STL tower didn't. And when they put when the previous engineer put in Starlinks, it would go off regularly in the morning during the spring and the fall, whenever the dew would be on the leaves and stuff like that, because it would scatter the digital signal. And we ended up having to switch it back to an analog STL, and that was enough to power through it. So I mean, like I said, it was a little noisy, but you didn't have the dropouts that you get with digital. So
Right.
Fresnel clearance is more important with digital, at least in my experience.
Yeah,
Now,
digital's a lot more touchy in that respect, yes.
Yeah.
having said that, I did have a guy call one day with a situation, and he called, and you always call the transmitter manufacturer when your audio goes away. Not 100% sure
You
what,
do?
but they seem to.
Oh.
Anyway, so they were calling because their audio was dropping out consistently at between 1 and 1:15 every afternoon. And so finally, being the inquisitive sort that I am, I said, so are we sure that it's the transmitter, or is the audio not getting into the transmitter? And he said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, why don't you stand out there? You got all these little things with lights and moving needles and stuff, and just stand out there and watch all those things with lights and moving needles, and see if when the audio goes away, the lights are still blinking and the needles are still moving. Calls me back the next day and says, figured it out. And I said, yay. Turned out FedEx was parking right in front of their STL mast, which was fairly low. And that was all it took in that particular case. So then in this picture, that would be the center example. So yeah, exactly. Now,
And
Bill Putney makes...
that zone gets wider the lower the frequency and the longer the hop. So if you've only got like a 1.5 mile shot, it's really small. But when you've got a 22-mile shot like Josh, that margin there could be 30, 50, 100 feet in certain instances if you're using like a TSL, like a 450 link.
Well, and the other issue is, when your studio STL tower or the originating tower is only 45 feet tall, depending on what the receive height is, the ground may end up being blocking Fresnel clearance.
Yep. You can run into the earth. And
Right.
remember, curvature of the Earth does play into a part of this. At
Yes.
at your heights and your distances there, Josh, in your example, I believe you have to be at least 150 feet at 900 megahertz to go 20 some plus miles, because otherwise you run into the ground at 20 miles.
Wait, the Earth
Yeah.
is round?
Oh my,
I didn't know that.
Okay, okay,
been
guys,
told.
we're not. No, 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 no,
All right.
no, no, no.
But
We're
no, that is that's a valid consideration. If you have a very low point, or if you're nestled between a high point and your tower's on one side, one low point, you got a 1,000-foot tower over here, but your studio's kind of in a valley over here, and there's a hump in the middle, you got to get over the hump just the same.
right.
Well, and that was,
And
that tongue-in-cheek joke was partially a joke, but it's also, when you look at a lot of the STL path calculators, there's an option for flat Earth calculation, and then there's the option that actually calculates the curvature. And the
right,
longer your path, you have to make sure you use the one that factors in the curvature, because if you go with a flat Earth calculation, then you're not getting a true vision of what your path is actually going to look like. So that
Because
was
not
right,
only does it
partially a
affect
joke,
your
but there was some
terrain,
to it. Right.
it doesn't affect only your terrain, but it also affects your azimuth too, because it can change the tilt of the dish just the same.
Correct. Yep.
right. And on that note, William Harrison mentions that he's got a 61-mile, 950 meg hop, and that is one of the things that we'll talk about too, is frequency versus range.
I have a
Um,
question on that one. How much power is he putting out for that?
well, you could throw a 10 meg. What was that Crescent amplifier that's Mosley used to provide with the Starlinks?
Well, that was the
So he,
Starlink. If it's analog, I had one that one in Dayton. We ended up putting an 80-watt TPL 950 analog amp on it, and
Mhm.
it was going into a paraflector, and I calculated the TPO of that, or the ERP at that antenna was like 1.6 kilowatts or something
Jesus.
ridiculous.
Yeehaw. And in this case, William says that he's running 8.5 watts with 8-foot dishes on each end. So he's making it up with antenna gain.
Okay, all right.
He's got some gain there.
Yep.
Yeah. So the other thing to be careful about, and we have alluded to it gently, is if you're doing your plot and looking at curvature and everything's wonderful, that's beautiful, but you can have something that shows you that you've got a reasonably workable link. And if it's not allowing for these little things I like to call trees, that's a whole different ball game right there. And this is an example. Our local station, we had a wireless STL that turned out we can't use because we would need to put up about a 150-foot tower at the studio end to get to the transmitter site, and the town doesn't want that. So anyway, so yeah, tree cover, ground cover, and Alex, you'd mentioned something about pine needles.
Yep. The nature's perfect attenuator is a Norway pine needle. It's 950 megahertz. Imagine that. Pine needle's about that long, about a wavelength at 950, and it's full of water. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of them around here in the Midwest. So knowing your surroundings and very much so your environment. Norway pines aren't exactly prolific in Arizona, for instance, but I've heard stories of cactus needles causing similar functions in desert areas because, oh, look, it's flat. I'm going up a mountain. Well, it's full of cactuses. Why is it scattering? Well, cactuses are full of water too.
Hmm.
Um, things like that. Norway pine needles are like the little pain in the butt around the Midwest when it comes to high frequency links like this. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not only it's the perfect attenuator at 950, but any harmonic thereof. So it's amazing what it does to 5.8 just the same.
Right. Uh, Avoiding tree cover totally. Kirk Harnack mentions that in Hawaii there's a 110-mile 950 meg link with the public radio there shooting from Oahu to Kauai. Now, on the other hand, there's a question. I wonder if they ever have an issue with seagoing vessels blocking the path. I suspect on a shot that big you wouldn't have too much issue, but
I would
that'd be a
assume that's
curiosity
mountaintop to
thing.
mountaintop, but interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
I would be
Uh,
I'd be more interested to see the theoretical water scatter over the
Yeah, I was
ocean.
thinking the same thing. Yeah.
the inversions, yeah.
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 Oh, and Kirk does say that it's mountain to mountain, yes. Don Eastman of Kentucky says that they had an issue with their STL path where the university built a dormitory in their STL path and the cranes lifting the roof panels would wipe them out.
I
And
saw something not too long ago on Facebook about, I think it was Robbie Green down in Houston, where they're building a new high rise right outside the window of where their STL is going.
mhm.
And he's got to figure out how to move their STL literally through a building.
Yep.
Yep.
And I mean, the cool thing these days with things like unlicensed band Wi-Fi links, now I'm not sure I'd recommend unlicensed band for Houston necessarily because it's a pretty RF dense market, but with unlicensed band or licensed band, as far as that goes, just wireless IP bridges, it's not that expensive to do a two hop and literally shoot through a building by putting one on one side and one on the other.
The modern version of a passive reflector, except these are active.
Hmm.
Mhm. No, I mean, you remember, it's any of you ever seen one where they'll shoot the STL to the AM tower and then put the dish at the bottom to shoot it into the transmitter building? So
Yep.
you don't
I'm do-
have
I'm
to.
I'm doing that right now with IP. So
hmm
that's the link that we're
Mhm,
building. It's a 4-hop to get to the AM transmitter building.
I use it as an ISO coupler
mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
to
that's
cross the base
exactly
of a
right.
hot AM.
Yep.
Okay, and Rich Hahn wrote me a book. Rich, I don't know if you've got a microphone or not, but I'm going to unmute you. And if you've got a microphone, then unmute yourself and you can explain this to me, or otherwise I will read it. But I don't promise not to take some artistic liberties with it because she's a long comment there. Um, so Rich is staying muted. We're going to assume that he can't unmute, but he
Let's
mentioned,
try this. Can you
there
hear me
you
now?
go.
Hey, Rich.
Hey,
All right.
Good morning,
So,
gentlemen. Yeah,
so you'd mentioned the Fresnel zone there, and
as there's such a thing as too much Fresnel zone clearance. If you happen to locate even multiple Fresnel zone clearance, the first zone, you wind up with cancellation of your signal because the reflections wind up being out of phase with the desired signal, and it can make things act pretty squirrely. I've run into this where somebody figured the more actually lowered an STL receive dish and greatly improved the reliability. The problem was they were at 2 times the clearance of the first Fresnel zone.
hmm
The other
yeah,
thing that you
yeah,
get, of course, is if you're too high, you're more susceptible to receiving interference. But you do still have to have that first zone clearance.
Right. And if
right.
you look at Jeff's graph there, you notice that it kind of creates more bubbles and lines. So you see the direct path, the first, second, and third Fresnel zones. And all three realistically should be cleared. But yes, like you said, you can certainly have too much where they will cancel each other out, especially if you go over large bodies of water. That's why we always run into that, is they will phase cancel going over water from scatter. Very,
Exactly.
very true.
Now,
There's
going
also
back
such
to
a thing
the,
as too much signal just the same.
yep, and that's another thing. I ran into a situation on a fairly short, like a 10-mile hop, where somebody put one of the 10-watt amplifiers on a Starlink and just basically blew right through. We did a demo in Madison a few years ago where we actually had to aim the two ODUs away from each other because the signal was so strong. They were only 20 feet apart. They were literally swamping each other.
Yep.
Um, Back on the building in the way, John Van Milligan suggests a high power laser to burn a hole through the building.
Hey, that's a good plan. I like that.
It's a it's a solution. It's definitely that would work. Um,
Noted.
he, al- he also mentioned that he had the same Fresnel problem on a 7 gigahertz link, and that is
Mhm.
correct. Although, and that's one of the things we'll talk about in a slide or two. As you move up in frequency, the zone gets narrower, but it does not change the problems. The physics stay the same. It's just different math, just different numbers.
Mhm.
So it is something to be aware of. And that's in this particular case. So we did the study where we could get a clear line of sight, but again, trees came into play. And our solution in that case was looking at a higher frequency because then you've got a narrower Fresnel zone. You've got something workable. Again, in our case, towers were too high. We ended up just moving the studio anyway, and now we're fiber end to end, so it doesn't matter. And that comes back to another question that we'll lead up to in a moment, but at what point do you decide that maybe you should have a backup to your wireless link? Crickets. Josh, got a thought on that?
Always. I mean, that's always been my opinion. Is I advocate backups to everyone, and there are lots of different options. It's early on with the IP delivery stuff. You could do. I deployed some 10 years ago that was an Edcast encoder on a PC that was going to a barracks box at the other end that was literally just riding along the internet. And if their main 950 link went out, it would switch over to that. Wasn't great, but it was, something. In today's world, there are lots of different options. You can, we offer Max Connect that I recommend to people all the time for backup STLs. It's still internet, but the fact that it's prioritized, it works better because it's a consistent stream as opposed to just a consumer hotspot where it's real bursty. And then there are, depending on if you're running a 950 link as your primary STL, if you have the ability, put in a 5.8 link or even a 2.4 link if it's rural and it's not overly overly microwaved. Any type of something to get something on the air is better. I have at my, world's most overbuilt translator site, I've got 3 different ways to get audio there, and I have a solid state recorder with 6 hours of pre-recorded programming of my station that if literally everything else goes down, the remote control will go click and put that on the air. I don't have any spots on, but at least I'm still on the air.
Right.
So, with everything that's available nowadays, whether it's, HughesNet or whatever, there should be some way that you can have the ability to get something else on the air to keep your station up, whether it's a second STL path, an internet path, an LTE path, or just something at the transmitter site that you can switch on with your Burke or Gentner or whatever.
Right. And
yeah,
I mean, you can make that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alex.
So when I design facilities like this, and being more IT centric in my world, and we're trying to bring this into the modern radio era of disaster recovery. Again, what if you do have to abandon your studios and that point-to-point link isn't an option anymore? If you're looking straight at the eye of a hurricane or a forest fire, how are you going to get that signal in? It's called disaster recovery. So yes, when I build systems, I build them in powers of 3 for redundancy, because after you hit the 3rd time, you've got a really big problem, and probably getting to the transmitter is getting lower on the list as time goes on.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
So in the powers of 3, the diminishing return seems to be right about there. So yes, if you have a point-to-point and a backup point-to-point, to me that's just one link because it's still a point-to-point. To more of a Max Connect system where that will be my second one in, because then I could get to it from anywhere. And then from the 3rd time, the 3rd thing is literally, as stupid as it sounds, I use Comrex and plain old phone lines that you can still get in certain instances, because that is the last bastion of hope to get you on the air.
Connect the matrix and put it in music mode, and you've got something.
Exactly. And then,
and for us,
then once all those fail, then the Nautel system has a thumb drive full of music on it that it's going to do it itself.
Exactly.
Yep. And that's exactly the way we work it. I mean, we've got the codec for the fiber for the first line, and then 3G for the second, and the little USB stick for the third, and away you go.
But I think that's the point I want to drive home, though, is if you have a 950 and a 5.8 or a 7 gig, whatever, IP plus a traditional microwave system, in that world, you should be thinking that that is just one link, not 2.
Right. Because if that tower goes down,
you're done.
Well, if the tower goes down, you've got bigger problems.
That's studio end.
Yeah, true. Or if something happens and corrupts that path for whatever reason, you've got 2 radios. Yeah, they're in different bands, but if something blocks that path, you're still hosed.
Right. So that's why you have to treat that as one thing. You can't treat that as 2.
Now, having said that, it is one and a bit, and Mark Voris makes a mention where they used two dishes at the transmitter end, two receivers, one dish up toward the top, one closer to the bottom. So when conditions changed, it would switch the receivers to the one with the better signal.
You can do
And
that. That's an old voter system type of stuff.
Yep.
yeah, and Ray Lewis mentions that they just put a 1 mile hop in Atlanta where they put a power beam pair in for a couple of $100 and saved a whole bunch over their multiple kilobucks budget. So again, depending a lot on the priority and on what you've got to work with, there are a lot of options out there.
Right. And as we keep going here, you'll start seeing what those options are starting to look like because they're quickly coming off the table.
Yep. And Kirk Harnack again makes a good point. Kirk, I'm going to unmute you for a second because this is a great point, and this
Well, we know he has
speaks
a
to.
microphone with the hair.
I am pretty sure that Kirk has got a microphone somewhere within his reach at some
It's
point.
probably better than all of ours put together.
Right.
So, Kirk, if you want to unmute and tell me what you're talking about with the internet stream, because I think that's a really cool point.
Hey, thanks a lot. And so, what I've been able to do at all of my stations is we're using a stream encoder for all of our radio stations, public internet streams, that is licensed per input, not per output. So, for example, one of my stations might be my classic country WDTL. And with my stream encoder, of course, I make a 48 kilobit HEAAC V2 stream that goes to our internet provider, and it's a lower bit rate stream, right? But I can also, in a minute, I can spin up another stream of whatever bit rate I want. So let's say I'm going to be on my internet stream at the transmitter site for a while. Okay, I don't want to be on the 48 kilobit stream. I'm going to spin up a 256 kilobit stream, and it's well, as my old mentor Steve Church used to say, 256, well, actually 384 kilobits of AAC is unimpeachable audio. No, it's not linear, but it's unimpeachable. It sounds really good. And so you can deliver, you don't have to deliver your regular consumer internet stream to the transmitter site. If you have the ability to spin up a private stream, this is not going through your CDN. Spin up a private stream and voila, you can put that on the air and it'll be as reliable as your internet feed is, and it'll sound great.
Yeah. And this comes back to some of the stuff we've been talking about in the Nautel Telos webinars with the micro MPX and virtual servers and all that great stuff too. There's just so many options available. So Kirk, thanks very much for your input on that. Mark Forrest mentions that his tie-line Bridgets have an SD card with backup audio on them. So,
Yes, they do.
backup audio built right into your codec. So another great idea.
Yep.
So
there's several. Everybody realized when we started going into IP that backups were going to start becoming a bigger thing because, let's be honest, no one builds them the way they used to. They just do not last 30, 40 years anymore. So you have to plan for the inevitable.
now moving forward, talking about satellite band, because satellite is RF also, and if you're on a C-band downlink, you've probably heard about this little C-band repack thing going on. Josh, I think you've had a little experience with that. How you guys been seeing?
Honestly, I'm probably not the best person to ask about this because I don't have any clients that have C-band downlinks right now. I do know that one of our clients has been dealing with this, but they've been dealing directly with Mark, so we haven't had a whole lot of involvement. But I do get a lot of inquiries. People call and ask about Max Connect, and they're like, I got this thing from, that I need to decide what to do about taking the buyout or the reimbursement. I don't know what to do. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you because, to be completely honest, I haven't researched this that much because we just
Not
haven't had
my
to deal with
turf,
it.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
So
And I
that-
have been working with some stations with this, and from what I understand is you have to work with your specific provider because they may be moving satellites, they may be changing transponders, they may be just going IP straight out anyway. So they're going to make you buy a filter, a bandpass filter. No one knows except
Yeah.
for where you're getting the content from. Even yourself, if you're using, let's use like EMF as an example, who does have a few C-band downlinks. You know, they're going to have to do something to mitigate their own uplink and downlink systems.
Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the cool things. I say cool things. Mark Johnson with Link Up Communications has done a fair bit of research. If you go to Facebook and go to their Facebook page under Link Up Communications, they actually do have a few videos talking about the registration and talking about the current window that's open to allow you to correct or modify your registration. And keep in mind that this isn't to allow you to register a new downlink, but to fix a filing that you may have open already. And that will have an impact to some extent on your ability to make any claims on this. So definitely, if you're running C-band and downlink, it's something to be aware of. Mark Forrest says that they already have had to change transponders for their downlink. So definitely, it is something to be concerned of, not concerned about, but aware of for sure. And if you're not looking at your backup, this is the time to be doing it.
Yeah, you can't just look at the dish itself and say, "Oh, I'm okay," because its nearest cell phone tower is a mile away. That doesn't matter.
No.
You know, it's the how many people, show of hands, remember how noisy pagers were in the 950 band? Because pagers were right next to STLs, but they didn't have to mitigate anything. We did.
Right.
So we're going to run into that same problem with satellite. So while your ESPN downlink is working just fine, your MRN link, which is on one transponder over on the same bird, may have a lot of problems. You just don't know.
Right.
So you have to contact your providers to figure out what's happening at that level.
Right, because some of them, as you said, some will be repacking, some won't. It purely depends. So
you may end up with two different dishes in your yard depending on your service providers.
Right.
Yeah.
And that second dish may end up aiming right through a cell tower.
And Bill Putney mentions a really good point that it'll also be the mobiles, and they'll be wandering around right in front of your receive dish.
Exactly.
Yep.
So
noise is noise in this world.
Yep, exactly. Let's see. Sean Mattingly makes a comment here. Sean, I know you've been able to unmute before. Would it be okay if I unmute you? Actually, I'll tell you what, I will unmute you. So tell me what you're talking about here with the Starlink.
I sent an example video that I made for management when I reanalyzed an STL link that was cutting out a lot. It was one of those Mosley Starlinks. And I just made it as a visual thing for management to see. I took Google Earth and plotted out the studio and transmitter site. And I also had some little 3D objects on Google Earth representing a factory they had built since the STL was put in. And there was a water tower, and a big new Lowe's store in town was right in the wrong place. And it led to us improving the STL setup eventually. And I put it's an unlisted video link that I made for managers to see back in 2012, but it kind of shows you a quick way that you can plot that out on Google Earth. And now, of course, Ubiquiti has a good STL planning tool that you can also use and plot each end. And it does an amazing job of helping you visualize what's in the way.
Now, the caveat with the Ubiquiti tool, and that was the one I clicked earlier on in this, and I don't know if they fixed it, but at the time, a couple of years back, they did not do ground cover. So
as far as I know, they still don't account for any ground cover, but they do one thing. They do one thing that I wish we could take the Nautel RF tool and the Ubiquiti tool and smash together, is adding together the satellite view of being able to look down over that link and say, well, you know, you can show tree cover on the Nautel one. Well, I can see terrain on the Ubiquiti one, but you know what I can't see? Lows.
Right.
Yes. I like to use the two tools in combination with each other. You first do it on Ubiquiti, and then you plot it out on Google Earth and look at it from the top and from the side, and even draw on the height of trees, which I plan on those usually being 85 feet tall, and I draw them as tall green objects wherever I see a a stand of
Yep.
trees right in my path. And that's a
Mhm.
pretty good guide, whether you're going to be
Yep.
shooting through them or over them.
Yep.
Yep.
Planning
All
an
right. No.
STL is
Yeah.
not just getting up on the roof and looking and making sure you got it working. You actually have to do a little bit of work on figuring out what's around you and what could be coming. What is that land over across the street development for?
Right.
What is
Right.
it zoning? You may have to call the city and say, hey, is that zoned industrial or light commercial? What's going in there?
Mm-hmm.
Or even
Yep.
if that land is 7 miles away.
Right. And I mean, that comes back to, was it, I think, South Dakota, where you had the one where they had a water tower off the edge of their STL path.
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So, and Sean, with your permission, if it's okay with you, I'm going to have Ed post your YouTube link up into the chat so anybody who's here can see it, but we'll keep it restricted.
Yeah, sure. That's fine. That's fine. At the time I was narrating the video and I was pretty grim about all the objects I was finding in my way. And
Mhm.
it's a good study in, how to do a study and also what not to do.
Excellent. Well, and for side note for anybody else, so Sean's the guy that they got a new transmitter not long ago, and the transmitter box ended up in his backyard, painted blue and decorated amazingly like a TARDIS. So
It was
Love
a
it.
surprise present for my wife, who is a giant Doctor Who fan.
That's
And
awesome.
she still marvels at the thing far in our backyard, especially on a foggy morning. It just
mhm.
looks eerie.
Yeah.
That
Perfect.
Brian Gullickson wants to know if it's bigger on the inside.
It is, yes.
It's a
All
part
right. Well,
number I haven't seen in the system yet. I'm going to have to order myself one.
there you go. Yeah.
She still doesn't
Nautel
know how it
TARDIS.
got there.
It's a
That-
timey-wimey thing.
now, at some point, you're going to have to take it out of there and say, I guess they went back to their own time. But
Mm.
that's too much fun. Thanks very much, Sean. That's excellent. All right, Edward. So if you get a moment in Sean's comment, there is a YouTube link. If you want to put it in chat and make it available to everybody, that would be awesome. Thank you so much for that. Moving forward, after the C-band, and this is not technically STLs, but this was posted for a specific reason, and that is just because you think you're licensed doesn't mean you're safe. So
Nope.
Alex, I'm going to get you to tell this story, or tell your story specifically about the wireless mics.
So a couple of years ago, Minnesota, we spent a fortune building the ugliest football stadium ever known to man. And so we had the Super Bowl as the commemorative thing. Or sorry, the big game. We can't say that anymore. So it was here in town, and Minneapolis being a major market, we have all the corporate affiliates of the alphabet soup, and they did the halftime show stuff downtown, Prince and all this other stuff, and more Stay in the Time. Well, one of the local television stations didn't read the STA, where the NFL basically pays off the FCC and says we're using all the frequencies now, and continued to use their wireless microphones, which prompted the visit from the sniffing crew who had the trucks out looking for signals that were violating the STA that the NFL had applied for. And their answer was, well, we don't have wired microphones. All we have are electrosonics.
Oops.
Whoops. So that kind of put the kibosh, and I think they ended up running over to the local Guitar Center and buying whatever they could to keep doing their stand-ups from the remote truck downtown Minneapolis. And I can tell you right now, it's not the station that's in downtown Minneapolis. So yeah, it was an ENG truck that the FCC
Yep.
was not happy about them not paying attention to that.
There you go. See, $65 on Amazon. Keep one in the drawer in the toolbox all the time.
Yep. Yep.
So that's a really good point. There was another situation coming up. There's a licensed band, or one of the STL bands is going to potentially go away, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, and it already has. The 6 gigahertz band has been freed up for home Wi-Fi, and consumer routers will know it as Wi-Fi 6E. It's not the AX stuff where it combines the 5.8 and the 2.4, but they've actually opened up the 6 gigahertz band that we all just paid a lot of money for a licensed microwave link for IP,
Mhm.
and now everybody's got one.
So
So
this comes back to what we were talking about before, belt braces, and Josh, like you were saying, with the multiple layers of backup for your communications.
Well, the other part of that is, as far as spectrum that's going away, I know a lot of people that, and honestly, there are a lot of people that are still running it. The original Mosley land link and those types of radios were in the 908 to 928 ISM band. And that ISM band is being reallocated in the not too distant future. So anybody that's running a legacy land link, and I think even the more modern ones were still in the same band, or if you just got some microwave concepts diplexers and some Ubiquity bullets or M900 locos or something like that, if you're doing that because it was a cheap, easy way to get a data connection into your transmitter site using your existing hardware. You plug a brick in, you plug the ISM radio into it, and it would still run through your existing dish. The efficiency was garbage and your speed wasn't very good, but it was a data connection to get to a remote control or whatever. I know a bunch of people that are doing that. I know one place that has that is the data connection to every one of their like 16 transmitter sites. And they're going to have to redesign that entire system when that band goes away and is reallocated for cellular usage. And that's one of those things you've got to try to make sure you stay up on this stuff anytime you're using, unlicensed bands especially, but even licensed. I mean, in the 6 gig realm, one of the other clusters that I used to work at put up an 18 gig link for an STL that was going 7 miles. It was the same one that had the oak tree. It was going 7 miles. It was shooting over a river. It didn't work. Surprise, surprise. And then they got a licensed 6 gig link, put it in. It worked fine. Well, now they have to replace it with an 11 because the 6 gig is going away. So by the time it's all said and done, they're going to have spent like 90 grand on hardware for this link over the course of like 6 years.
And if anything, that's proving with all of this that the FCC has kind of just said, okay, the spectrum's for sale to the highest bidder. Satellite isn't even off limits now. So don't think that if they're going to go after ISM 908 to 928, they're not coming after the 950 just the same. They're going to take that 100 megahertz swath right in one foul swoop and then tell you about it later.
Maybe
Well,
2 or 3 fell swoops, but yeah.
Right,
Well,
but
I
it'll
think-
be just as quick.
Well,
Where
I think
the deed is already done. Here's your reimbursement. Bye.
Well, I think there's a better chance that they will carve out the ARL STL band simply because of the nature of what it's at. It's not that wide of a spectrum, and they'll probably take everything around it, but I think they'll leave that band alone at least a little bit longer than the other ones, simply
Right.
because it's not that big and it is extremely disruptive.
But
So-
if they do that just the same though, Josh, if they do that, if you're on the high end at the 954 part or down low at the 948, the FCC has proven so far that they have not carved out guard bands. So you're going to have to have
I
some
agree
kind
with
of
that.
band pass filter.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you're looking at a line item, an unexpected expenditure to deal with this problem.
Well, and we're already dealing with issues with harmonics for LTE off of STLs. That's happened.
Yes.
I've had 3 different places where some AT&T tech shows up at the studio door going, "Hey, I'm getting a harmonic," and we traced it back to here. It's at -104. Well, that's illegal. Well, it doesn't work for us. And then somehow all of a sudden,
It's your problem.
Yeah, you're jumping through all these hoops to try to help AT&T because you're legal, but their stuff is down in the noise. I mean, your phone,
Well-
if you look at the LTE signal on your phone, it's running below -100 dB most of the time.
Yeah, well, you've got the biggest signal in the area, so you're the guy that they can go after first. And
I had
it all comes back to
the
the resources.
CPU
too.
oscillator on a 900 megahertz radio. It wasn't even the radio itself. It was the CPU on the radio causing the interference to Verizon.
Yep, it can happen. Now, one of the things that Bill Putney mentions that will definitely help keep you awake at night is plot the usage curve of the internet from the late 80s to 2020, so the last 40 years, then extend that into the future and wonder to yourself or ask yourself, will cellular ever have enough bandwidth?
True.
There's always, I mean, we're pretty much at Moore's law for cell phone use for data usage, so it's doubling every couple of years. Yeah, it's there's always going to be a need for the spectrum. So something to think about. speaking of things to think about, I added a whole bunch of other questions here that you should ask when you're thinking about an STL. And this is where folks are going to play What Did I Miss? Oh, Ray Lewis has a question for Josh. Heard that Marty SP or RPU must go back to factory for frequency change. Any intel on RS-232 commands to change frequencies? Do you know anything about that?
We do not. I take that back. It depends on which Marty it is. There are the later model ones do have to go back to the factory. Even in our service center, they have not shared any of those protocols with us. It's got to go back and be done with that. Same applies to the STL 20Ms. The 20Cs are frequency agile. The 20Ms, there's a little header you've got to plug their little proprietary programmer into, and they've never, I've been asking for years. I offered to buy it from them, and they won't give me access to that. So no, unfortunately,
Okay.
that's got to go back to them.
All right, good deal. So
and one other thing to consider here is as we start transitioning, into these IP worlds or different modulation techniques or different bands, we've kind of moved to IP, whereas the traditional RF, the audio codec, whether it be analog or digital, is usually built in. In the case of a Starlink, for instance, it's got an audio card. It's doing all the OFDM stuff. The hardware is doing what it does best. When we move into the IP world, now you have to decide how the audio is getting across that link, whether it be a Comrex or a tie line or a Maya or a streaming PC or a Zip One, whatever fits your station. And those are things that now link budget means a completely different thing. So when you're doing you have two link budgets to deal with now, because RF in the traditional sense of here's my Starlink, I've got 4 channels of audio on it, cool. Well, your link budget is the RF link. Well, now you also have to calculate that RF link in, like, say, a 11 gigahertz manner, but now you also have to do data capacity link budget of what are you going to put across that link and what is your pain tolerance. You have to overbuild it to make sure that you never hit that pain tolerance. Right. So things to think about when you start diving into this world as, do you have enough codecs? How much per channel are you doing HD that you need for continuous streams of audio to go from one site to the other? Do you have a translator that needs a feed just the same? You know, things like that.
Yeah, and Bill Putney's asked if we're going to talk about the Axia and Nautel over IP-STL, and Bill Telos and Nautel did a webinar series on that, and we've hit on it in a couple of archived webinars. So I'm not going to hit it a whole lot today. Today I was kind of aimed at more at the technicalities, if you will, the technology of doing a wireless link and why you need backups for them. And like point-to-point distance, I'm not going to shoot a 6 gig, an 11 gig hop or STL hop 30 or 40 miles as a rule.
Other things to consider here in the Midwest is, what's really funny? 5.8 and 2.4 are actually very noisy in rural areas. Why? John Deere.
Ah, yes. Yeah. All the automated ag stuff.
The ag stuff is using them as PTO control.
Yep.
So shooting over a busy, 10,000 acre farm that's got combines running, you're going to end up with a lot of noise on that link.
And I mean, something like that, more and more that as that stuff gets automated, it can be running pretty much 24/7 in a lot of cases. And I mean, a tractor that's parked isn't making anybody any money unless it's there for maintenance.
Exactly.
Well, the other thing to consider when you're talking, especially about 950 links, is polarity, because I ended up with one 15 years ago that it was a shot that was from my studio to the site was 1.3 miles. It was a Starlink. We had boatloads of signal. Everything was good, but there were a couple of times, and it was fairly consistent in the afternoon, where it would mute for sometimes a minute. And they chased that and chased that and chased that for months. And finally, I started asking some questions and doing some research. And it turns out that we were south of an Air Force base. and the dish at the receive dish was at about 250 feet on the tower for a 1.5 mile hop. It didn't need to be that high.
Too high.
And it was also vertically polarized. Well, the majority of the antennas that the military uses are vertically polarized. And there just happened to be something that they were blasting away in that general frequency band that, you know, every afternoon at 3 o'clock, it would just boom, there was a burst and it would take the thing completely down. We were out there with a spectrum analyzer one day, and all of a sudden the noise floor just went zoop, and then a minute later it went back down. And you know, there was a lot of discussion, and they lowered the dish to just above the tree line, flipped it horizontal, and the problem went away. So that's something to consider, especially if you are within any type of line of sight distance of a military installation. If you're having issues, consider changing your polarity to horizontal, and it may correct that.
And remember, that does require an FCC filing and coordination in the 950 band.
Yes.
So you do have to make sure you're not interfering with other neighbors you may have around you. Like St. Cloud here is a very small but radio heavy community. There's 15 plus radio stations in a town that's 6 miles wide. So there's a lot of 950 flying around here that we're crossing everybody's paths. So it's very carefully coordinated that we're not going to touch anybody else. To that same point, show of hands, how many people have had pigeon fade?
I've had owl fade.
Owl fade, bird fade in general. That feed horn is a perfect perch come sundown. So things to, why is your STL going off? Well, might be time to get a hawk. Things like that.
I've had raptor fade once, but that was a Starlink shooting through a Air Force base, and when the F-16s were doing touch and goes, it would kill the Starlink signal.
I had a maintenance guy whose dissemination method was when things would land on the tower, he'd wander into his little room and get this little brown bag out. And first time he did it, I'm like, Bob, what are you doing? Oh, I'm gonna get rid of these birds. And I went out shooting bottle rockets in the parking lot, scare the birds away.
Now, Laverne Siemens asked a question here. For a 950 STL, is there a preferred polarity to deal with inversion fades? And that is a good point, because a lot of times we're shooting across water. Any thought about that?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, because if you go vertical, you're going to end up with a lot of rain fade, and you're going to end up that actually causes a different, margin issue. But if you go horizontal across the water, different problem. You get reflection. So is one better than the other? It depends. And it depends on how big that body of water is, how high you are. What I can tell you is that a 950 link, I have one that is, the STL tower is 60 feet tall in the back of the studio to get up and out of the valley that the station's in. But the receive antenna is at 450 feet. Just like Josh's problem, where we're listening to every little thing. And you can easily, and their answer before I got there to try and figure out why they were having so many problems was they just kept adding power to the transmit. They had a 50-watt boot on their transmit to go 6 miles. Because they couldn't overcome that noise. But the problem was they were getting complaints from other radio stations, because on that frequency with that much power, they're blown right through their dish.
I ran into one not long ago where it turned out that they were having an STL fade situation, and what the end result was, there were two 950 signals pointed exactly in parallel at exactly the same height, one licensed, one picked up on eBay. And so, if the wind blew, it just shifted the tower enough that the signal, they cross streams.
And this is where that coordination comes into play. Even in the unlicensed, know your neighbors. Talk to your guys around town, because the Fresnel zones, I had a station that was very similar. They had 258 links parallel to each other, and those are cross pole. They'd use both horizontal and vertical, but they were physically maybe 2 city blocks away from each other.
So
and they were bumping into each other in the middle, and they would cross and cause noise.
You've got to consider beam width whenever you're looking at the antennas. And that, that's the joy of doing larger antennas, because someone mentioned earlier on that 60-mile plus shot, he had 8-foot dishes at both ends. I've had instances where we've had to use 10-foot dishes.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
I've had people complain that, oh, we're hearing everything. Well, what's your receive antenna? Oh, it's a Yagi, or it's a paraflector. Well, paraflector, if you look at the beam width on a paraflector, it's 40 degrees wide. So
Mhm, mhm.
it's literally going to pick up anything off the sides. A Yagi is worse than that. So
Yeah,
the bigger the dish, the more concentrated the beam, and you can oftentimes null out a lot of that noise, especially if it's
right.
coming in from a side.
Well, I mean, you
So
used the
now,
C-band example there where you realize that those 10-foot, 12-foot dishes are staring at something the size of a Volkswagen bus 40,000 miles straight up.
Hmm.
yep, yep.
There's a reason for
Now,
that.
and on the topic of fade, Kirk Harnack, Kirk, I'm going to get you to unmute. You've got made a comment about a story about sun fade. I'd like to hear this.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible. Actually, it has to do with a larger topic of setting up IP radios, and more people are doing that. And talking about the sun fade, and I'll get to that. It's when you set up a 950 megahertz STL system, there's little, if anything, to choose. Right? You set up the antennas in the coax, you point them at each other, and you turn the system on. You can choose the frequency, perhaps. You can choose the polarity, and there's not much more you can choose other than that. Maybe your coding scheme, if that's built in. But with an IP radio, you have a lot of choices of things in the menus, and a couple of the most important ones, at least for us as broadcasters, we're interested not in ultimate wideband throughput. We're interested in reliable throughput end to end, and that is not going to coincide with the biggest bandwidth. Now, if I'm shooting, live wire streams from one place to another, they take 2.5 megabits per second per stream. I don't need a gigabit from one end to the other. I don't want that, because to get that, you have to go 80 megahertz wide on the channel and like 256 QAM on the modulation. So I have a couple of systems that I initially set up for. I cut it down to 20 megahertz of RF bandwidth on these IP radios, and I selected, instead of auto selecting, I selected a low modulation scheme like QPSK. Or maybe 16 QAM. And so these are more robust, because you want robustness on this link. Well, on one link that was 13 miles long, twice a year, the station would go off the air in the morning. I'm thinking, huh? What? Now, sometimes it would go off the air because of inversions, because if the conditions were right for fog, not necessarily if there was fog or not, but if the conditions were right for fog, we would go off the air on 4 stations at once. And so after thinking about it and doing some calculations, I realized that, oh my goodness, the sun comes up behind the transmitter tower when you're looking at it from the studio. And so the sun actually spends a couple of minutes in the path. Now, why is that important? Well, it's not with an IP radio, it's not a one-way path. It's a two-way path. And with the IP radios from Ubiquiti that I'm using, if one way doesn't work, well, the other way won't work either.
Yep.
And so it was keeping it from working in either direction for a couple of minutes. Now, I solved that problem and the inversion problem both by narrowing the RF bandwidth to 10 megahertz, which is as narrow as it would go on that system. And I believe I still had the QPSK for the modulation. Point is, I need about 10 megabits per second in each direction. And I think the capacity, this is a system advertised as a gigabit system.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm getting like 26 megabits from end to end. That's the capacity, but I don't need any more than that. And it's been completely reliable since I narrowed the bandwidth. I had to do the same thing with the system in American Samoa, only a 3-mile hop, same radios, and occasionally they were unreliable at the 20 megahertz bandwidth setting. Set it narrow and go with a simple modulation scheme. Just use what you need.
And it's funny because when you said sun fade, I was thinking, solar flares for downlinks, and this was a whole different thing. So thanks for that, Kirk.
The sun becomes the transmitter.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and more to Kirk's point too, as well, is when you see an advertised, like you said, it was advertised as a gigabit system. Airspeed is not wire speed.
Nope.
They are different. So make sure you understand those differences when you deploy an IP STL, where it says, oh, look, you've got 400 megahertz or 400 megabit capacity because I used a 60 megahertz wide channel. Well, no, you probably have maximum 200 megabits both directions, and on the wire speed, that's probably closer to 100 megabit. So you have to pay attention to those delineations of what marketing versus reality has done in that world, because gigabit speed, sure, probably is gigabit just fine if you put it on the conference room table and turn it on.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, marketing is ideal conditions. I don't know anybody who operates a radio station under ideal conditions.
Right, exactly.
And
Shooting across a warehouse versus, shooting it across, central Tennessee is not the same.
Right.
And that comes back to one of the most important points about this session is you buy the best you can afford, but you build it to be the most robust. So you minimize everything. And then as you add more things and need more things, then you can potentially let out the bandwidth. Elaine Jones makes a good point, or an interesting troubleshooting tech tip. A whole bunch of years ago, Elaine, you're not that old. Not too many years ago, when Elaine was working at KSL, one of their engineers calculated sun interference at a certain day, and twice a year had to go up to the roof to shade one of their antennas.
Nice.
Okay.
So, hey, you see standing up there with an umbrella to keep the sun off the dish. That's
like sweeping the snow out of the satellite dish.
Right.
Well, and depending where you're at, I mean, if you're in Alaska, see, your dishes are almost perfectly vertical, so there's very little snow. But when you get down closer to the equator, that's a
down in
southern
Florida,
thing.
they're bird baths. So
Yeah.
Fortunately, there's not a lot of snow down there either.
right, but I mean, you realize that RF still has to follow the laws of physics. It doesn't matter if it's 450, 950, 5.8, 18, 24, 60 gigahertz. It still has the clearance issues that you have to account for. Don't go over, just because you have a 450-foot tall tower, don't put the receive dish at 450 feet. Get it only as high as you need it to get. With what I calculate here in Minnesota with Norway pines, they grow. The Forest Service will tell you the average growth rate in an area, of those types of trees. You can say, okay, well, it's going to grow this much a year, so on and so forth. The best thing to an STL is literally a chainsaw in this part of the world. That's the only way you're going to fix this problem. So if you're going to say, okay, well, I need 200 feet, well, no, you probably need 225 feet to survive the next 10 years.
Right, and that goes back to what Sean was talking about. You calculate, for example, with trees, calculate 80 feet, then you're going to be good for future proofing as well to some extent.
Exactly. So don't put it at 450 because again, you're going to find the Air Force Base. You're going to find the local airport. It's actually kind of interesting. I did this once, and if you're any sort of interested in DXing, go grab an old Marty STL R10. It's an analog receiver. Stick it on an antenna that you got shoved way high in the air. Doesn't matter if it's actually tuned. And then open the squelch and take a listen to what you actually hear. There's still plenty there.
Exactly. Okay, on that note, we're pushing close to 5 minutes past the hour. Mandatory slide about all the resources, webinars. This webinar will be archived in a day or two. Mr. Disembodied Voice, Ed Sylvester himself, will have this up. He's usually very prompt about this sort of thing. Waves newsletter, I'm told that there will be a new one coming out imminently. There better be, because I created content for it and I didn't stay up way past my bedtime doing that if you guys don't get to read it. And of course, the YouTube channel. Mark Voris also mentions that railroad comms are bad as well. And
they
that's
they still use AM.
Yeah.
Yep. So even better. On that note, Josh, I want to thank you very much for spending your day with us. Alex, the same thing. It's been a pleasure to have both of you.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, folks, for staying with us, and have a wonderful day. We'll see you next week.